Welcome everyone to my video on possible openings against d4. I really appreciate you being here. If you don't mind, you can give a like, subscribe, comment, whatever all the YouTubers say. And let me take a little bit of a second to explain exactly what I'm doing. So I coach chess students, right? I teach chess. I also have friends who are lower rated, things like that. And one common question that all of my students ask me at some point or another is, what do I do against d4? And I believe it's commonly asked because against e4, which is the most common chess opening, by the way, against e4, a lot of people know exactly what they're doing. They play e4, e5, like I do, by the way. They play Sicilian, Karo-Konolov, strong players are playing. Heck, they play the Alyekin's defense, for all I care. So I believe a lot of people know what they're doing against e4. And for whatever reason, they can't quite pinpoint what they want against d4. The options may seem a little bit bleak. It might be like, oh, if I play d5, they might play the Queen's Gambit, and then do I want to go into that? King's Indian looks, passive. I don't know what the heck is going on with the Benoni, things like that. So maybe you have more questions against d4 as black rather than e4. And what I want to do in this video series is I just want to go through not all possible openings literally, but all the legitimate openings against d4, just give you a little bit of an outline as to what the moves are, what the common plans are, things like that, and hopefully just give you some guidance and a framework as to just some possibilities that you can play against d4. Now, today we're going to be looking at two openings today. We're going to be looking at the Dutch defense, which is f5 on the first move, and we'll be looking at the modern defense, which is g6. Now, I'll explain why I'm doing those two specifically, those two specific openings when I have a chessboard in front of me, which will be here in a second. So you'll hear about that in a second. Now, what I do want to mention as well is this is not comprehensive. This isn't a course. This is just a video I'm doing. So I'm not going to be able to explain every little line in detail. I may not even have the most accurate variations. So for these 2200s who are watching this, please don't attack me. I'm just trying to just help people out, just help people choose their openings. And if you want to do your own independent study outside of what I teach you, then that's totally fine. But yeah, that's really all that I wanted to say. I'll just give a couple of little disclaimers. This is my first time actually recording a YouTube video in a while, and this is actually my first time properly editing a video. So honestly, I just hope this turns out really good. I just wanted to say that, so if you don't mind, once again, just feel free to subscribe. As I speak, I'm at 88 subscribers, so if I can get to 100 maybe after this, that would be awesome. But yeah, let's dive into the chessboard. Alright guys, as I mentioned earlier, this video will cover two openings against d4. We are going to be looking at the Dutch defense first, and later we will be looking at the modern. Now, why did I select those two openings? It seems like two random responses to d4. Well, I would say the d4 branch comes in three parts. You have the d4, d5 branch where white generally plays c4, and then, black can play Queen's Gambit declined, black can play a Slav. Heck, black could play an Albin counter gambit for all I care. So we are going to be looking at d4, d5 options in a separate video. And the second branch I would say is d4, knight f6. Now, if black plays something like e6, knight c3, d5, this transposes to a Queen's Gambit decline, for instance. So the focus of that video will be, King's Indian defense, Nimzo Indian defense. We'll even look at the Benoni, heck, we'll look at the Banco. We'll just be looking at possibilities within d4, knight f6. And so the reason I decided to go over d4, f5, and g6 first are because, well, they're simply not d5 and knight f6. So let's go ahead and get started. So after d4, the first move of the Dutch is f5, and oftentimes having the f-pawn out can be useful in the opening. As a lot of you will probably know from the King's Gambit, it can be very helpful to have the half open F file potentially for use, especially if white castles this way, and especially if we castle that way. Therefore, we'll have a rook on a half open F file potentially. So in this video, we're going to assume that white plays traditionally a traditional d4 opening with moves like c4, knight c3, knight f3. We'll even cover, g3, bishop g2, which a lot of players do against the Dutch. Sidelines like, e4, for instance, or if we play g6, they go h4, h5. We're not going to cover here. I mean, this is not necessarily a comprehensive, course or anything like that. So if you're curious about certain sidelines, I mean, I don't know, f3, e4 for all I care. If you're curious about certain sidelines, I would definitely encourage you to do your own research. Maybe one day I'll make videos on those, but this is just meant to be very simple to lay the groundwork. So we are going to assume that white plays the move c4. So after the move c4, I would just play the move knight f6. Knight f6 is nothing unusual. You're just developing a piece like you normally would anyway. And again, white can play whatever they want, but we're going to assume that white plays a move knight c3. That's very common in these d4 setups. Now, in this position, there are a number of ways to go. You could play the move pawn to e6 or pawn to g6. Those are going to be the two lines that we look at, sort of the two options that I potentially give you to play if you choose to pursue the Dutch. So we'll start with the move e6. Now after e6, we're going to assume that white plays knight f3, and in this position, I would actually play the move bishop b4. And I believe the ideas and themes behind, bishop b4 and the following moves are very instructive and simple to learn. So what does bishop b4 do? Bishop b4 develops the piece. It also pins the knight, and if white lets you, you might just be able to take on c3, not only doubling their pawns, but something critical in this position is the fight for the e4 square. So we're going to be kind of looking at that a little bit out of this position. So there are a number of things that white can do in this position. White can play something like bishop f4. I mean, they could also just play like, e3, blocking in their bishop, and then develop the bishop, castle, whatnot. A lot of this is very interchangeable, but if white is smart, they're going to play bishop f4 before establishing the pawn chain with e3 so that the bishop is still active. Now, after bishop f4, I would recommend d6. As we'll look at later, it doesn't necessarily apply in this position, but d6 can have the idea to fight for the move e5 later on down the road. And it's also very useful because you might want your knight on d7 rather than like on c6 or whatever, but we're still keeping flexible. So after d6, we'll say white plays e3. Black castles, we'll play bishop d3. Now, this is what I think the cool idea is behind bishop b4. Now, you could play it now, you could play it later. Heck, I don't care. You don't have to play it at all. You can play this move bishop takes c3, and the reason for that is after b takes c3, we're simply fighting for the e4 square. And guess what move we're going to play next to help enhance our fight for the e4 square? We're going to play b6. And then we're going to put our bishop on b7 and put more control on the e4 square. Now, let's actually look at this a little bit. If white plays a4, we'll just go knight e4. And we have a very nice knight on e4. Now, white, as you can see, is still slightly better. Again, that's if they play super accurately. And if you get this type of position and white takes on e4, I would actually take with the pawn. Taking with the bishop seems very natural just to keep your structure intact, but I would actually take with the pawn. Yes, you have doubled pawns. Yes, maybe you're thinking this pawn could be a weakness in the future, but it's well protected by the bishop. We could always like reroute a knight from like d7 to f6 to protect it, maybe even play the move pawn d5. And if white plays a move like knight g5, don't blend or fork, I would just go queen e7. And in this position, you're actually just threatening to win a piece. So if white just plays a move like rook b1, then you can actually play the move e5. And you're attacking the bishop. The pawn's protected by another pawn and the queen. The bishop is protecting the knight. There's nothing to do. So if you win a piece on move 13, 14, then that's awesome. Now, if white is smart, another thing they could play is just move pawn to g3. And we'll actually see pawn to g3 a lot in the Dutch. Obviously, the idea is to go bishop g2, but, more long-term, You see, black is trying to attack on the king side. You can sort of see based off the structure that they chose. So black generally attacks on the king side. So white generally in turn tries to attack on the queen side. It's sort of a strategic concept. It's a little bit advanced, but that's the main reason why g3 might be played. Now, you can still adopt the same strategy. Here I would play d6, white plays bishop g2, we'll castle, and you could still play now what I would do is I would still play bishop takes c3, b takes, doubles their pawns, you fight for the e4 square. I wouldn't necessarily play b6 though, and it's just too risky, because if you play b6, they already have a bishop on the g2 square, just eyeing the rook. And as the computer says, white can just play a move like knight g5, and then you're thinking like, oh no, they moved the knight there, my rook is hanging, I gotta play like c6 or something, and this just looks too flimsy. I mean, it's not terrible, as you can see. Best move is apparently d5, but I would not go into this. I mean, a lot of your pieces aren't developed. I think it's just a little bit risky. So after b takes c3, you can just play a move like knight c6, and honestly, just play for e5, As we'll look at later, e5 can be a very potent weapon in the Dutch. If you need to, you can play like queen e7 or queen e8, put a rook on the e file, just play for e5, and I'll show you ideally. You can ignore the computer eval. I'm sure it's going to crush me, but if you can get e5, this type of structure, it's just very ideal because you have a nice grip on the center. You could potentially play e4 to kick the knight, or maybe even f4 in some situations. I don't know if it's really thematic here, but f4 trying to open the king side, open the bishop. You never really know. So that was e6, and now let's go ahead and take a look at g6 in this position, which, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it's called Leningrad. And the idea behind g6 is to go bishop g7, but as we'll see, there's a little bit more to it than just that. Long term, you might be fighting for the e5 square. As I was mentioning with e6 and the e6 variation, white, they can play g3, bishop g2, which is obviously what we'll look at. After knight f3, bishop g7. Again, not that the move order really matters, but I just like to assume these are white's first 4 moves. A lot of the ideas are the same, but, we can assume that white will play either bishop f4 and e3, or that white plays, g3, bishop g2. So after bishop f4, with the idea to go e3 and just develop the bishop, a lot of what we do will be the same. We'll play this move d6, white plays e3, all very natural. We'll castle. Now, again, you don't have to do this. A lot of times, white might play a move like bishop e2. This will probably be very common. You could go for knight h5 and just trying to get the bishop. That's totally fine. And, if bishop g3, then you can take, and after h takes, you have the bishop pair. They have the open h file, but at the moment, they can't really utilize it that well, so there's that. If white is smart, then they might play a move h3, and I probably would not play knight h5 here just because they can go bishop h2 and just kind of hide their bishop. And now, what's your knight doing on h5, right? It's just on the side, not doing very much. So I would just say after h3, I would just play normally here. I mean, computer is saying knight e4, which you could certainly do. It's also saying c5, but I think even just something like knight c6, just playing something like that, and, just in the future playing for e5, I think that could be very useful. And as I was mentioning earlier, e5 can be very potent if you can get it. And now for g3, which is the main line, and as a Dutch player myself, as a d4 player myself, I face this line a lot, when I'm white and my Dutch opponents are the black pieces. So after g3, we'll do our usual, we'll castle, bishop g2, d6. Now again, castles and d6 can be very interchangeable. You could play d6 first, you could play castles. It doesn't really matter, as long as you play those 2 moves. After castles, in this position, I would play the sneaky move queen e8. Now what's the idea behind queen e8? I'm sure you guessed it by now. It's to play the move pawn e5. And as I was showing earlier, if white just does nothing, I don't know, chills with a3 or something, you just go e5, and, this position, I don't know, it's just a dream. I mean, you have a nice connect 4, you have a very nice pawn on the e4 square. Black has a space advantage, believe it or not, in this position. So, if white just dilly-dallies, then, you're just going to play e5. just expand in the center, and it's going to be very good for you. So there are a couple things that white can try. There's one that I've seen, and I believe I've even tried, because, you know, I'm human, I mix up my prep and things like that. White could try something like queen c2, just trying to play e4, and there's this line of, like, you know, with queen c2, we're going to play e5, because they didn't not allow us to play e5, so we'll do that. And after e5, d takes e5, white might try this move e4. I believe I've tried this before. I could be wrong. I could have my lines mixed up, but honestly, after e4, I wouldn't really worry. I would just develop with, like, knight c6, and ultimately, you're just going to keep developing. If white just sits around, you know, you always have the option maybe to take and just try to, like, spice things up. And if white takes on f5, you just take with the bishop, and I mean, just, like, I know we have an isolated pawn, but just look at our piece activity. I really like what we're doing. Our rook's on an open file. I mean, like, we'll put a rook on the d file. I just really like what we have going on. White plays queen b3. You don't even have to protect this pawn. I mean, it could potentially, not queen a7, but it could potentially be a poisoned pawn. I don't know. It just seems very risky to take it, but even if they play something like that, there's nothing wrong with playing a move like rook b8. And after rook b8, you're doing completely fine. Now, the main line, which I oftentimes struggle to remember in over the board games, is actually this move d5. And d5 is a move, just in general, your opponent is going to play it. Either they don't know what they're doing, it's like earlier in the game and d5 is just too premature, or if it's in this specific position, they know what they're doing. Now, d5 doesn't absolutely stop e5. You can still legally play it. The problem is after d takes e6, you know, bishop e6, you know, the earlier capture was an en passant capture, which is, you know, a weird chess move. And if you don't know what that is, just look it up. It's essentially where your pawn moves 2 spaces, and on their next turn, they can actually capture diagonally like this. It's pretty weird, but it is a move. You know, your pawn structure is split, your position's not as dynamic as it was earlier, and your opponent has time to play moves like, you know, computers saying, like, you know, knight d5 or knight d4, just kind of get their pieces activated, and it's just not great to allow that. So if you get this far, which I would say if you get this far theoretically, then your opponent probably really knows, you both probably really know what you're doing. So if your opponent plays d5, then you can just play, I believe a5 or knight a6 are both moves, both with the idea, like, I like a5 first, and then let's just say, like, I don't know, white just, I didn't have lines prepared here, but, you know, the idea is to go knight a6, and the idea is just kind of, like, hop on the c5 square. Your knight will be pretty nice there, maybe contribute to the fight for the e4 square. The reason I like to throw an a5 first is if you play knight a6 and just kind of dilly-dally, then white can play this move b4 and just kind of get an expansion, which you even see the computer eval. It's, you know, it's totally fine, but, you know, that's just what I like to do. For our second defense in this video against d4, we just looked at the Dutch. We are now going to take a look at the modern. Now, the thing about the modern, to the untrained eye, well, trained because they know to control the center and things like that, but to the untrained eye, it looks passive because it's like, you know, you're not putting a pawn in the center. Like, what are you doing just playing a move like pawn g6? Now, I will say most people are going to probably play like e4, and we're not going to look at that. That's a whole separate, you know, just like, that's a whole separate just opening. I mean, you just play like bishop g7, d6. I don't even know. Well, I do know, but, you know, our focus in this video is going to be if white just insists on a d4 structure. So as we looked at with the Dutch, we're going to be looking at c4, knight c3, e4, knight f3, things like that. So let's say that white plays the move pawn to c4, which is, you know, if you're a d4 player, that's probably going to be your second move anyway. Now, what I will say is if black plays the move knight f6, then that actually transposes to a King's Indian defense, which we will cover in our knight f6 video. So in order to properly play the modern, not even properly, but just play it without really transposing, you want to delay the move knight f6. So what we're going to do is going to put our bishop on g7. That was our idea behind g6. And we're going to assume, again, white can play whatever they want, but we're going to assume that white plays knight c3. In this position, we're going to play d6. d6 has the idea to give the knight on d7 a home and possibly fight for e5 later. And let's say that white plays the move e4, which a lot of d4 players will do. As you know, with the King's Indian defense, it's generally d4, knight f6, c4, and e4, so it's generally this type of structure. We're actually going to play the move knight c6 here. And knight c6 has a very simple idea, just to attack d4 with your knight and your bishop, and pose white questions. Now, there are a few things that white can do. I mean, they could ignore the pawn, which, I mean, if they do, by all means, take it. I mean, you get a free center pawn, as the computer even testifies, you're doing very good. So we are going to assume that white is somewhat smart and knows to protect the pawn. Now, if white just plays a move like, d5, we can actually just hop our knight into d4, and it looks dangerous. It looks like the knight is just kind of laughing in the face of danger, but truth be told, you can always just protect it with a move like c5 or something like that, or even e5. So, if white plays bishop e3, and I didn't necessarily prepare this, but yeah, we can just play the move c5, and if it's captured en passant, we'll just, just recapture with the knight, and, we're doing totally fine. Our bishop is now open. This is totally fine for us. So if white plays d5, just don't be afraid. Just go knight d4. So after knight c6, another thing that white could do is just play the move bishop e3. I would say that's actually the most accurate move, and I'm going to include what I think. Now, I don't know if it's the most common variation, but I'm also going to include the most natural move, which is knight f3, which I also believe to be a little bit of an inaccuracy, not too much, but if white plays the move bishop e3, then we can just play this move e5 directly. Now, an exchange never scares us. I mean, our bishop will be open, we can take with the knight, or a bishop. I don't even know which one is necessarily most accurate, but the critical move in a position like that would be d5. Now, as we did look at earlier, you can certainly play a move like, knight d4. Again, you're not really that afraid, and if knight e2, I think there's even c5 or something like that. However, you can also even just retreat, just play knight c to e7, and from this position after knight f3, and as I mentioned earlier, if you play an early, well, it's move 7, it's not that early, but if you play knight f6, nothing wrong with it. You just transpose into a King's Indian defense. In this position, I would just play the move pawn to f5. That's one of the points behind the modern defense, which is that you're trying to facilitate a move like f5, and in a perfect world, now this is not a perfect world, this position, but in a perfect world, white castles kingside, and you just push your f, g, h pawns. You just murder your opponent down the road. However, in this position, it's not that possible, because if you play g5, the knight is right there, but that's part of the point behind f5. As we looked at with the Dutch, just having the pawn on f5 can be very useful. It could be a useful attacking weapon. It could also be useful with the half-open f-file. So I just looked at some moves. After bishop e2, we can just play knight f6. So now it's a little bit different, because we do finally play knight f6, but with our pawn on f5, and we're also somewhat threatening to take on e4, because now we have more attackers than they have defenders, and okay, there's a number of things that white can do, and again, if there are certain variations you're curious about, now you can put it in the comments. I'll probably be able to answer. I'll probably be happy to answer. I'll also try to post a PGN or something like that in the description, or you can just look it up on your own, but if white takes on f5, we'll just take with the knight. I mean, we'll go after this bishop, and compared to on move 1 when we played g6, look at where we've come a long way. I mean, we have very good piece activity, maybe c6 in the near future, just to chip away at the center. That could be very good. Now, in that position, so I believe that bishop e3 is the most accurate move. What I feel like a lot of people will play, though, is just this move knight f3. It's very natural. And let me just go ahead and take a quick sip of my water. So knight f3 just seems very natural looking, because you're developing a knight you're going to develop anyway, and you are protecting the d4 square. However, you can play this move bishop g4. Bishop g4 is actually kind of tricky if white doesn't quite know what's going on. If white just plays a move like bishop e2, let's say, then you're just going to take on f3 and then win the d4 pawn. That's one of the ideas behind bishop g4, is to try to like attack the center vulnerability like that. So if white is accurate, I think I also, I didn't necessarily put this move, but d5 you can play like knight d4. Again, we're not really that worried about it, and yeah, if white plays bishop e3, we'll just go e5, and once again, we're not worried about a trade, especially here since like knight takes would attack a pinned knight, so we'd be pretty happy about that. But once again, if d5, we can just play like knight d4. We're not at all afraid. You know, if bishop e2, there's like bishop f3, and then we can just play a move like knight e7. You know, so with the purpose to play like f5, once again, we could, you know, who knows, we could get our dream attack, and, you know, that's just that. So yeah, that basically covers what I wanted to talk about. I mean, I didn't really have a lot of insane lines prepared to look at with the modern. I just wanted to give you just the key ideas, you know, just after d4, g6, just the ideas like bishop g7, d6. And if white gets the whole center, you could put your bishop on g4, you know, after knight f3, you know, things like that. With the modern, it's called like a hyper-modern opening because you're not attacking the center directly with pawns like we're traditionally taught to, but we're attacking the center with pieces and, you know, just later with pawns. All right, guys, so that was the modern defense and the Dutch defense. Now, as you could probably tell, the Dutch is much, you know, heavier in like theory and stuff like that than the modern, at least from what we analyzed. So as I mentioned in the intro, you are more than welcome to do your own independent study as well as, you know, just watching this video, hopefully giving you some guidance. Parts 2 and 3 on d5 and knight f6 will be out very soon, so if the modern or Dutch do not interest you or you just want to evaluate your options, you know, just feel free to wait around for that as well. And yeah, I just want to say once again, just thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it, and I will see you for the next video. Take care, guys.